Hello and welcome to the latest webinar as part of the Innovative Law Practice Techniques series presented by the ABA LP Division's Legal Project Management Committee. Today we welcome Justin Ergler and Keith Maziarek. Justin Ergler is the Director of Alternative Fee Intelligence and Analytics for GlaxoSmithKline. Justin works with in-house counsel and law firms to develop non-hourly value-based alternative fee arrangements for GSK legal engagements worldwide. In addition to achieving the goal of killing the billable hour, value-based compensation models are designed to strengthen the partnerships with key firms via risk-reward sharing incentives. These fee agreements allow GSK to achieve their goal of linking fees with the actual value delivered to the company through excellent representations by outside counsel. Justin holds a business degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is a veteran of the United States Army's 3rd Infantry Division. Keith Maziarek is the Senior Director of Client Value at Perkins Coie. Keith works closely with the legal operations executives at the firm's top clients to establish strategic pricing arrangements, implement customized communication and collaboration tools, optimize service delivery models, and improve performance monitoring and reporting. Prior to joining Perkins Coie, Keith earned an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. He went on to serve as head of strategic pricing for DLA Piper LPP, where he developed, implemented, and managed the firm's strategic pricing, profitability, and LPM functions. Keith is the past chair of LMA's annual P3 conference, the industry's largest annual event addressing transformation in the legal industry related to pricing, project management, and process improvement. Before I turn things over to Justin and Keith, I want to let everyone know that we will be recording this webinar and we'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the video. We will get this video out as soon as possible. At the end of our webinar, we will also segue into our Q&A segment. Please do not hesitate to type your questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. Thank you all for coming. All right, take it away, guys.
Thanks, Austin. This is Keith Maziarek, and I appreciate the great introduction there. I feel like that's the longest form bio that I have, but there's not a whole lot you guys don't know about me now, but I'm very pleased to be here presenting today with Justin on some of the work that we each do respectively, and we've got a working relationship from the past before, so hopefully we'll be able to share some interesting information with everyone. One thing I would note too is actually back when I was a much younger man, I actually worked at the American Bar Association in the section of labor and employment law. So it's fun for me now to get to kind of come back around and be on the presenting side. So it's a fun opportunity for me. So that said, we can kind of jump right into some things here. Just to go over some of the content of what we plan to cover today. You know, it's probably no surprise based on what the title of our program is here. We're going to do, you know, we'll kind of dive in a little bit to strategic pricing, some of the levers, some of the processes, and you know, aside from the more procedural or operational aspects of it, of those of strategic pricing, we'll talk a little bit about some of the drivers and sort of the value chain of what you know, what you try to achieve through non-hourly pricing. So we'll try and keep it, you know, we'll try to address, you know, multiple points. But we will have a little bit more of a focus on some of the non-hourly pricing models and methodologies. On top of that, you know, a big piece of it, which we'll get into, has to do with matter budgeting. You know, we'll talk a little bit about processes, some of the tools that can help you with that, and how budgeting is actually a very crucial component of not only strategic pricing, but then LPM, which we won't touch on in great depth because, you know, I know this is the Legal Project Management Committee. So I'm assuming that, you know, much of the kind of fundamental and beyond fundamental aspects of LPM are well-known facts here, but we will, you know, talk about some of the touch points there. And then a couple other things we'll touch on other than some of those procedural or practical tips there is things related to how the business of law is done from a pricing standpoint between clients and firms these days. The world has changed a lot. Which you know has been echoed ad nauseum in the media for the last 10 years now, but that has brought about a lot of change, and you know we've been through some interesting scenarios. So we'll share a little bit of information and some experiences on just sort of best practices related to submitting bids, negotiations, those kind of things, and then just get a little insight from our humble perspectives on sort of where things are going. So. That's a little roadmap of what we'll cover, and I will actually turn over to Justin now to kick things off.
Okay, so at GSK, kind of my role, my background, I started out in procurement, and I kind of ended up having a focus in my procurement role on the legal space within GSK, I moved over to the legal department proper, I guess, the legal ops, as it's commonly called. And our general counsel, what he wanted to do, he wanted to do the cliche kill the billable hour, I think as Keith said, talked about ad nauseum. And the thinking was, and oftentimes you hear, well, that can't be done, we can't plan, we can't do this, we can't do that, it's too much work, there's not enough benefit, etc. And this is just kind of a simple thing that I know Keith has used this slide before to talk about. Here are some of the things that we can plan on a flat fee basis. So if we can do things like this, then we can do legal matters, right? Especially legal matters that we've done many, many times, which is how my lawyer friends have built their expertise, because they've handled similar cases, similar transactions, similar matters over years and years and years. So that's just kind of this slide here. Keith, can you hit to the next one, or you?
You got it.
So kind of all this aligns into the objectives of the clients. I guess that's what I can speak to. You see the things up here on the board, the spend containment, the results, the transparency, etc. The overarching thing of this is the client they want everything, right? They want the transparency. They want to understand what bills are going to be coming in. I almost wasn't able to make this conference. I think I gave Keith a little bit of a scare about a half hour ago, because we had an incident where we had a surprise. And it was a financial surprise that made a lot of waves, and it had some difficult conversations internally, and there will be a difficult conversation with the law firm coming up on Monday. So I guess the overall thing here is how do we focus ourselves to deliver on the client objectives, okay? And for me, it's all communication. It's putting in the legwork up front. So I guess the quote Keith and I kicked around, that one of us said, I forget which one, is how many client relationships have ever been damaged because fees were never disputed or never caused any issues? I would like to think that number is 0. So when you're going through this presentation and you're listening to us, kind of talk, I encourage you to think about, not only, okay, here's what is wanted by the client, here's the goal of this, but it's much more about how you get there. And nothing we're going to say is rocket science. I mean, quite frankly, it's all really basic, all right? It's all really basic. But the issue is, please don't gloss over it, because it is basic, right? And it is stuff that you've heard ad nauseum over the years. The problem is, the reason why you're still hearing it is because most lawyers don't do it, okay? So when we talk about this stuff, think about, in a way, I would say, take it back to your own practice and say, is this something that I truly do, or is it something that maybe I think I do, but you know what, when I reflect on it, I don't give it the attention that I should in order to get the results that, guys like Keith and I are talking about. Do you have anything to add there, Keith?
Yeah, one quick point. I mean, a lot of these things have to do with certainty, or, Justin, you mentioned communication. And it just makes me think back when I first started getting involved in sort of the pricing, profitability, budgeting, LPM world. I heard a lot of different responses in terms of why sort of we were going to stick on billable hours, or sort of why it wasn't possible to get a little bit more creative in the way that we did the way that we went to market from a pricing standpoint. And a lot of it had to do with the argument that, well, anything can happen in this matter. I don't know, anything can happen. That is partially true. I would concede to some extent. I would say, with one caveat, anything within a certain defined universe of things can happen, right? So, and within that defined universe, there's things that are more likely to happen than others, right? So, understanding that, sort of risk aversion is, an important part of what the lawyer's skill set and mindset is. What we try and do is sort of mitigate the difference between possible and probable, to do a better job of delivering on what the client needs, from a law firm standpoint. And a lot of that has to, being successful in that has a lot to do with having a reasonable client on the other side, where you've got a good relationship built up, and you can say, look, we know these things, and we don't know this set of things. So as long as we both agree on what those are, and something comes up, if we have a surprise come up, we will stand together and figure out the best way to address it, so that there's an amicable, way to resolve the situation one way or the other. So that was something that popped to mind as
And
you were talking about the collaboration, communication.
Yeah, and,
Sorry,
and that's something, Keith, you touched on, and we'll touch on it later. I think that's something that's very important, is there is no one size fits all for this. And I think sometimes firms have ventured into more active scoping and doing some of the things that Keith and I are going to talk about. And maybe they've gotten burned on it. And I'll define kind of what burned means in this context later. But it's very important, and again, something that is very basic, but I don't think people do enough, is understanding who your client is and what their motivations are, right? There are certain things that I think, Keith, you can attest to this, I believe. There are certain things and certain levels of transparency and granularity, et cetera, that you would get into with certain clients. And I won't say you, I'll say, since you work for a law firm, I'll say hypothetically someone in your position. There are certain things that you would feel comfortable being absolutely complete open kimono about, and there are other clients where, you know what, that could come back to bite me because it will be used against me. So I think it's very important as we go through this and we think about it, that when you try to apply some of these principles, first things first, you got to understand your client and understand what their motivations, what they're trying to get out of it, and I think, quite frankly, how much trust there is in that relationship. Sorry, go ahead.
That's a great point. Great point. And actually, that's a great segue, so thanks for doing that, because the client's motivations, yeah, see, it's almost like we planned it. You'll notice that we tend to ad-lib a little bit here, so I hope that's okay with everyone, but we'll get through our content too. So the concept of understanding the client's motivations has a lot to do with, the drivers behind what the shift has been in the industry, which, historically, when there was a lot more supplier power and less buyer power, which we're definitely in a buyer power environment right now, law firms kind of acted in their own best interest, in the course of doing work for clients, right? So, and what I mean by that is a lot of the things that we measured, right? So we set up incentives that weren't necessarily aligned with what was in the client's best interest always, in terms of how we would measure our performance, what we would deem success, and the metrics we would use for success. So things like, again, these are a little bit cliche, but it's worth mentioning in the context of what we're talking about here, hours, right? So time doesn't really equal value for a client. So, but those are things that, to this day are still rewarded in the law firm scenario. So, so those are some of the things that we need to look at, that have sort of changed in terms of, what the incentives are. From the client side, discounts, right? A lot of clients have historically had this idea of, all right, well, I need X percentage of discount. And then firms were forced to kind of work around that, and a lot of us did, back when we didn't have as much pricing pressure as we have now. So it was a lot more of a seller's market back then, and now, discounts are sort of a blunt instrument in terms of how we do business, but it's one of those things that can be sort of turned into a more sophisticated instrument, I would say, if it's leveraged correctly. But that's again, that's part of the shift. Realization from a law firm standpoint, again, just going back to metrics that don't really mean a whole lot for a client. Measuring the percentage of money that you collect off of an imaginary number that you think that time is worth, represented by your rates or what your rates are with a discount, doesn't really do a whole lot for the firm, especially, mid-size and larger firms, to understand how much money they're making. You don't invest in public companies because they collected 86% of what their, manufacturer's suggested retail price was off their business. You do it because they've had, profit growth, right? Like, are their costs less than what their revenues are? And that's what you need to look at. So, that's been a big source of the shifting focus that we've had. And I just segued myself into the next set of bullets there, just, the concept of profitability. So there's, in recent years and not so recent years, I guess, profitability has really kind of stepped into the spotlight. It's something that was just assumed that would be fine before because there was less pricing pressure. But as pricing pressure, increased, then so did sort of the level of concern. It sort of boiled up, right? People started going, well, wait, if we have to give up this much, and from a revenue standpoint, the light bulb started coming on, and that kind of led to people with jobs like mine and Justin's, where it's like, well, wait, just how much do we need to get before we don't have any returns on this anymore, right? So, an interesting thing about sort of that shift in the metrics is that if you look at pure profit margin, right? Like if you look at what the formula is for profitability, and the profitability and the formula for realization, they aren't very well correlated, because you can have acceptable or semi-decent realization on a matter and be just giving away money left and right from a profitability standpoint. And I've seen examples of this, and it's definitely a mindset shift, and it's an evolution in the industry. So I just remember a story one time. We had this back in my old job. We had a particular litigation partner that had this legacy client. He'd had it forever, and it was great. And they came around to us and they said, "Hey, we need to renegotiate rates," and nothing had been touched for years. They had the same rates for, I'd say, at least 4 or 5 years. So when I started running the numbers, I looked at profitability, and I'm like, this is a bloodbath. Like the work was on the cusp of being pseudo acceptable from a realization standpoint, but we were just giving away money in buckets as far as realization, or as far as profitability goes. We were losing big time. So I tried to make the case. I go, look, these are delicate situations or conversations to have, but I said, here's how the numbers play out, and this is the actual sort of return on what the time that we're investing here is. We need to either fix this or talk about what the right actions are to take. If we can't fix the financial profile, we need to talk about, do we need to be doing this work anymore? And I got a very terse response from the relationship lawyer, and he's like, yeah, that's fine, Keith. Let's just give away $3 million in revenue every year. That's great. This is good money, and we're taking care of that. And I was like, my response to him was, I said, that's fine. I understand $3 million is a lot of money, but not when it costs you $5 million to deliver the services for the people. I said, so what you're essentially doing is you're having other people finance you having this client because you're losing money. So other people have to make money in order for us to float this client. And my Justin always reminds me of this. I did this in one of the presentations. I said, it sort of comes down to a situation where it's like, look, you're doing a disservice to the rest of your partners if you keep on those clients, unless you have other ones that kind of buoy the profit pool, right? So I said, it's worth, you can keep that client as long as you give all your partners permission to punch you in the face when they see you because you're taking money out of their pockets. It's obviously a little bit, brash of an analogy, but essentially it is. It's hurting profitability. So anyway, go ahead.
If I can just jump in quickly here, Keith.
Yeah.
I think what we're talking about, and you touched on it, was the pendulum of the leverage, right? It swings back and forth in any market, right, from buyer to supplier, right? And everybody says now, oh, it's a buyer's market in the legal industry. And they say, why? And they say, well, 2008, wait a minute, 2008 was 9 years ago, right? So while pendulums will continue to shift, I think that it's important that we keep in mind, and this is just something, Keith, you and I talked about, yesterday, and we hadn't really talked about it before, is that everybody references 2008 as, well, that changed this and that swung the pendulum. And I think it's important for the mindset to be that the pendulum isn't going to swing back, right? Is never going to swing back to where it was pre-2008. Because for folks like me, finance is never going to say, okay, we're good now. Go ahead and spend whatever you want, right? So if that's the pressures that is being faced internally, right? Finance, they're never going to say, swing it back. They're just going to ask for more. So if that's going to be the case, well, then that's the message that's going to be taken to the law firm from the client. So just real quick, as far as the profitability realization, in trying to figure out a way and trying to be able to explain that and trying to be able to make sure that you are on the right side of the ledger there is very important, because it's not like, hey, we'll take our lumps now and things are going to turn around later, right? 2008 is never going to go away. And the pendulum, while it might swing a little bit, it's never going to go back to where it was pre that crash. So
I agree with that. And actually, so that's we won't belabor this slide too much more, but the next point that we had written down here is an important one to make, and that's just that the focus of the work has now changed, and it's a very sort of apropos theme for this particular committee, being legal project management, because if you look at if you change the metric and what's being measured, what gets measured gets done, right? So if you change the metric to cost containment versus revenue maximization, that makes a big difference in what incentives are created, right? So if you know that you're getting X, for your price, which I'll go over, we have a slide on that later, and you know that you've got the revenue in the bag, that's yours to keep. The challenge for the law firm is to minimize the cost that it takes to deliver those services without without exceeding what your price is, and without, obviously, I think it goes without saying, but I'll mention it anyway, without compromising the quality of service to the firm or to your client, or anything, that any of the relationship drivers that help keep the relationship strong. So the one, and then I would say the elephant in the room, although I don't think it's even the elephant in the room, I think it's the elephant's bigger than the room now. It's the whale in the room. Clearly, on the law firm side, compensation structures haven't really been positioned historically to reward, I'd say, the profitability focus versus realization, right? So that is changing in a lot of firms. I know our firm has shifted that to some extent. My prior firm had. There's been some trepidation. You can't just flip the switch one day and say, hey, guess what, partners, we're not rewarding you for realization anymore in revenue. It's just going to be profitability, because that's too much of a fast shift. That's more of a revolution than an evolution, but we're getting there, and I like to think that the momentum's in the right direction. So, so as promised, our next slide, if I can get to it. It's not shifting on me now. There we go. Sorry. Just to go over a little bit, we did sort of promise that we would talk, a little bit more in depth about AFAs rather than rates. So, for anybody that may be out there that doesn't know what an AFA is, and I say that honestly because I'm surprised from time to time when people go, what is that AFA thing? So I'll say it. Alternative fee arrangements. So, just by definition, that's anything that is not, solely predicated on the concept of how many hours did you work and what's a rate for that hour. So, with that sort of basic, criteria in mind, some of the more popular models that we face a lot fall into a couple different categories. Everybody's heard of sort of the fixed or the flat fee, right? There's always been, I would say, a little bit of aversion to offer fixed fees because of that sort of historical reliance, I guess you could say, on the idea that anything can happen, right? So fortunately these days, and we'll touch on these same themes throughout, not only are there people out there that sort of have a little bit of a sophisticated eye in sort of analyzing what the historical data is on these matters that can take some of that ambiguity and some of that risk out of what the anything can happen proposition is. But there's also a lot of really great technology out there. There's some great software that's been around for a long time that does that multifunctional analyses on all kinds of different aspects of historical time entry data and those kind of things. And there's new ones that are doing an even better job. But even things so simple as just your plain old-fashioned Microsoft Excel with somebody that knows how to use it and can pull some data can give you certain levels of certainty with the modeling that you're looking at to make fixed fees not so much aspirational, but a little bit more practical, right? So, and one of the things I like to always try and impress upon people is that a fixed fee can be produced for not just a whole matter, right? Let's say that you're working on a particular variation of M&A deal or even litigation case, and there's certain, I mentioned the known knowns and the known unknowns, right? So if you know certain phases or certain tasks or certain deliverables are going to take a certain amount of input and a certain amount of effort, those are the kind of things that you can isolate and do them as sort of a fixed fee per phase or deliverable, that kind of thing. That does help to build trust with the client because you're trying to fragment out as much certainty as you can and give them as much budgetary certainty as possible without just saying, well, something might happen in phase 3, even though I know exactly what's going to happen in phase 1 and 2, more or less. So I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say we can't do anything, that even though the client wants something more creative than hourly billing on this. So just something to keep in mind, that you can segment out different pieces where you have certainty and price them on a non-hourly basis if possible. That could be fixed. That could be, also sort of the hybrid model. We'll get to the bottom in a second, like the fee collar. So, so that's, I don't think fixed fees are particularly controversial at this point, but just a little insight into sort of how people like myself will view them, that it's not all or nothing. You try and if the client's looking for certainty, or if they're looking for, other level of sort of, budget insight, those are the kind of things you can do instead of just taking it for all or nothing. So contingency fees, there's,
hey,
yeah, go ahead.
If I can pop in just real quick. So flat fees, so we do all of our work on flat fees. And when I say all of our work, I don't mean our, small labor and employment matters that are the $10,000 matter, things like that. We do all of our work. Everything, if you see GSK in a litigation or a transaction, that is under a flat fee. So I think while I agree, Keith, they're not controversial in general, I think the extent to which you can use them is. And I think that's kind of what we said earlier in this slide we'll be getting to in a moment, is it's all about how you plan it. It's all about the initial work that you do up front that enables you to, A, give the client a proposal or a budget with confidence, and B, internally, have everyone confident that this is a plan we can stick to, this is something that we could, have a good profitability on, and so on and so forth. And I will also say that one of the points you made earlier, Keith, that the whale in the room, I think, as far as the compensation models, yeah. There are a lot of firms, and they don't tell each other, I guess, but there are firms, at least that I know, that do our work. Maybe it's because we do our stuff all on a flat fee. That is changing. It's changing faster than maybe you think. Maybe not at a firm-wide level, maybe not publicly, okay? But firms are beginning to look more and more at how do we compensate our people? How do we look at bonuses? Is it purely hours? Is it more of what you would experience in a corporate environment, right, where I'm not judged by how many hours I spend, or I don't have a minimum hour threshold or something like that. It's a performance. It's what did you do for me this year, right? What did you do? What did you deliver? And things like profitability, et cetera, are starting to enter into those equations at a considerable amount of law firms. And I wanted to bring that up because I almost think it's something firms will come to us and tell us that, hey, guess what? We're getting the message. We're doing this. But if you look out and you Google that firm and Google, any news of them considering modifications to the compensation model, you never find it in a million years. So I think that it's something that in the industry at large is moving forward, but I think it's a little bit behind the scenes right now.
I would agree with that. Actually, when I was at DLA, every pricing model, every proposal I ever worked on, every time I counseled a lawyer on sort of what their pricing options were, and tried to work through, what the client's needs were with the partner to try and develop any type of different pricing. I started from the beginning putting profitability estimates in there and projections. And I knew that there wasn't a whole lot of familiarity with sort of what the drivers of profitability were, but I wanted people to start getting more familiar with the concept because it seemed to me that was where things were going. And this was like 7 or 8 years.
And I've seen with firm proposals, the trend, at least for me, from what I've seen, are firms when they're staffing are looking a lot more at not, okay, we need a junior associate for this role. They're looking and saying, we need Suzanne Jones to do this role, because Suzanne is uber efficient. Suzanne is going to have a high profitability on this. So, and that's working under a flat fee. But I'm seeing it's getting a lot more. It's putting faces with work as opposed to, and maybe that's how it's always been done. Perkins and whatever. But I'm seeing, at least on my side, a lot more. We're seeing that as opposed to junior associate time, senior associate time, et cetera.
Well, that's good to hear that that it's visible from the client side. I guess just to make my quick point on the sort of behind the scenes, I started introducing the concept even though I knew people weren't 100% comfortable with it, because I wanted them to ask and I wanted them to get more familiar with it. So what was interesting to see was that when comp time came around, I started getting a lot of partners that would come to me and say, hey, can you help me run some of my numbers so that when I go into my comp interview and when they have their numbers, I'm going to say to them, well, look, here's what realization was. And I understand that because I have my figures as well. But I want to also point out the fact that my profit margin on my portfolio work this year was X%, and that's higher than what the firm average is. So, if there's any question about what my contribution is from a financial standpoint, I look to my profitability to provide a little solace in terms of, whether or not I was providing, contributing financial help. And to me, that was a big win because they weren't being, formally evaluated on that. But, they started to see like, look, there's value in this, and that's a solid point that I can bring to the argument in terms of what the compensation formula is. So anyway, sorry, we're getting off on tangents again here, but I think they're valid points. So I'm glad that we're kind of delving into them a little bit. Back to the AFA model. So contingency fees. There's multiple versions of that. Some firms will do full contingency, which is interesting. Historically, Perkins Coie, where I'm at now, had done a fair amount of full contingencies that had gone through a certain vetting process. But where I came from before, we would never do a full contingency. I think in the 10 years I was at DLA, I saw 2. So it kind of comes down to the firm and the client relationship and sort of what the dynamics are. But we do partial contingencies are a very a much more common one, and they still enable the firm and the client to share risk and to share in the reward. But at least they do a little bit of opportunity. They do a little bit better job of, I would say, balancing the risk, right? So, and the success fee is a version of contingency that just the way I differentiate success fees are kind of like if they're tied to certain outcomes that have an extraordinary outcome for the client from a economic or financial perspective, right? So, if litigation's always an easy one, and let's just take the low-hanging fruit and say a plaintiff's case. If you're able to get a certain level of settlement or judgment on behalf of the client, then the firm can get more than what just the value of time would have been. So that's the way I view success fees and the difference between sort of contingencies and success, even though I guess from a risk profile standpoint, they still have similar aspects. But
just one quick touch point on that. It's about it also, and again, I'm going to keep going back to this because I think it's incredibly important. It's about being able to articulate what success looks like at the outset. I think clients are horrible at it. Firms are pretty bad at it too. Articulating what is our vision of success before we, or maybe not before, as we are diving into the work, right? As we are diving into the work, what are we trying to accomplish? What type of resolution does the client truly is the best outcome for this client? The client might not even, that might be a question where, hey, you know what? That turns into a discussion. You would think that what is the desired X, Y, and Z other than slam dunk win, whatever, great, yeah. That's an easy one. But what are the different levels of success? How do we articulate those? Then how do we align our fee arrangement, right? How do we align our fee arrangement to make sure that we're on the same page? And if I win, you win, so on and so forth. You're sharing that risk, as Keith said. And then out of that, you're able to design your work plans of how am I going to optimize what I'm doing to the most efficient and effective manner of achieving those desired outcomes. Okay, and litigation, as Keith said, is the easy, low-hanging fruit. For transactions, it might be, if we can get this closed by such and such a date, it's going to hit our books, it's going to hit our quarterly report and X, Y, and Z, and that's going to be great for us. That could be a huge win, right? But articulating that and inserting it into a fee arrangement, right? You're showing the client that you're aligned, but you're also setting yourselves up for a financial reward if you do that, rather than kind of waiting until the end of the thing and having to go to the client, not hat in hand, but saying, hey, we really did a great job for you here. It'd be great if you would consider a discretionary bonus or something like that. So it's one of those things where, again, a little bit of legwork up front can help you to structure things in such a way where you set yourself up, if successful, for a financial reward in the future.
Yep, I agree with all that. The last category that we have on here is hybrid. The fee collar, so I'll give a little background on the fee collar for those that may or may not be familiar. The process that you go through to structure a fee collar is very similar to the one that you would go through for pricing a fixed fee, and we'll go through that relatively simple process in a bit. But you still come up sort of with an expectation or a target number of what you think from a fee standpoint it's going to take to get the work done, and then you can negotiate that with the client as far as what they think is fair. The main difference between a fee collar between a fee collar and a fixed fee, is that you set up sort of there's a range above and below what that fee target is that you say if the quote-unquote actual fees fall within that range, it's 10% below or above, let's just say for argument's sake, then you pay the agreed upon amount. But if it falls outside of that range, then you take any number of different ways to sort of reconcile what the difference was, if it was a scoping issue or if there was an efficiency issue or whatever, and there's different ways to address those. So it's another tool in sort of the toolbox of non-hourly fees, I would say. However, it's kind of not non-hourly because it still is dependent on a measure of rate times time, because that's how you get your quote-unquote actuals, right, to see if you fall within that range. So, but it does set up the parameters for, it requires that you do a lot of diligence up front to understand kind of what's going to be expected and map things out and come up with that level, a comfortable level of certainty and consensus with the client. But it does still sort of make you, rely on going back and going, hey, how much time did we spend on this? So that's one of the things that make it sort of not a pure alternative fee arrangement, but because of its other dynamics, it's in there. So it's a hybrid. Deferred fees are similar, and you could almost argue that deferred fees could be somewhat considered a contingency, because there's usually some aspect of a reward based on what the outcome is for a deferred fee, but that kind of depends. Those can vary by instance. So. So now that we beat this slide to death, we will move on. Just to follow the decision path here the discussion path of juxtaposing sort of what hourly billing dynamics are and how AFAs differ and what the opportunities are. There's a pretty easy and simple business case to be made. I think, Justin, you wanted to take the hourly fee side of this one, so take it away.
Yeah, it's all about alignment. I mean, different clients have different appetites for moving away from the billable hour, even though they all say they'll do it. I'm sure, Keith, you and your peers that I work with and deal with all have horror stories of, yep, the client said flat fees, we don't want to do hours, we're off the hour, and then a month in they said, you know what, let's just go back to the billable hour, right? So there is that, because the billable hour is the security blanket. That's the collars route that Keith talked about previously. That's the security blanket of, I want to go flat fees, but I still want to know what it would have cost on the hour so that I don't have a buyer's remorse, right? Or I want to reap the benefit of your efficiency. The difference between that and kind of moving to an AFA that's a non-hourly based, and Keith, I won't steal this here, but I'll let you talk about it, right? Is that the thing that the case that we made to firms, and I mean, not that we had to make a case because we're the client, but the thing we said was, look, we are now aligning incentives with your best interest, not the firm aligning, but the client. We're looking to align your incentives with everybody's best interest, right? So before, if you're under an hourly model, if you're more efficient, you bring in less money, right? So that's not really a great incentive. I mean, although I know there's ethical and all that good stuff, but at the end of the day, the fewer hours you work, the fewer dollars come through the door of your firm. Under a flat fee, if we can agree, and again, this goes with upfront planning on what we're agreeing on and articulating the value that we're looking to derive from an engagement, if we can agree that based on this value that we need delivered, okay, based on this value that we need delivered, here's a fair fee for it. If that firm can go and look at not just junior associate, but I forget her name, Suzanne Jones, or whoever, I just made the name up. Suzanne Jones, we'll put her on it. She's going to be uber efficient, right? And in the terms of realization, but more importantly, profitability, right? As far as her time, it's going to be through the roof. If you've got a client, and this also goes to understanding your client, if you've got a client, then for GSK, we're happy about that. Great. We both agreed on fair value. You were able to do what we've been telling you to do for years and years and years, or not that for every firm, every client for years and years and years, and be more efficient. So now you have a financial upside because of that. So I guess that's maybe that's too simple. I don't know if you have anything to add, Keith, but that's kind of the way that we look at AFAs, and I think the way that progressive firms, and I'd like to say progressive clients, look at the kind of cliched win-win relationship of moving off of the hour. Everybody walks away happy. So,
Actually, I mean, you you pretty much, I think you touched on most of the main points for this concept. One I would add to it though, just to layer in the profitability perspective on it really quick to keep with that theme as well. Hourly billing, there's when you have an hourly billed model, for every hour that you bill at a certain level of revenue at a certain rate, there's a corresponding cost rate that doesn't change. Now, there's different methodologies for calculating cost rates, but a lot of it's got to do with saying, okay, for every specific timekeeper, what do we pay them? What does it cost to give them benefits? And then what allocation of sort of overhead do we assign to them too, right? So, and then if you divide that cost number of what it costs to have that person working for the firm as a timekeeper for a year, if you divide that by any number of production goal numbers, it could be pace, it could be what their hourly goal is for the year for billable hours, whatever. You come up with an hourly cost rate that corresponds to their hourly billing rate. So what you find is that, in theory, those are always in lockstep. So you'll never get, if somebody has a 20% margin at standard rates, they're never going to have a 30% margin at standard rates unless you raise standard rates, right? But there's not a point in theory, unless you work them until they're almost dead and they're way more hours than they could possibly be efficient doing anymore, where the cost starts to get spread out more and it lowers the cost basis, but the revenue stays the same. So theoretically, there's a parallel line there that you'll never make any more profit if you only do hourly billing. On the flip side, as I kind of alluded to earlier, let's say we'll use fixed fees as an example. You establish what the price is going to be up front, and you're going to get that money. Let's say it's $500,000. If you now shift your focus from the revenue side of things, because you already know what you're getting paid, to, all right, now that we know we're getting paid, let's make sure we keep as much of that as we can. You're going to go, okay, what exactly do we have to have done? It leads to other conversations with the client about, all right, look, what are your priorities? If we have the opportunity to depose these 10 people, do we have to do all 10, or is there a good probability that, we could get this done with these particular ones, right? You should be doing that all the time, but AFAs change the incentives, and they do give firms an opportunity to make more money. So from a profitability standpoint, and they also help, clients hit what their goals are in terms of efficiency and cost certainty. So I just wanted to briefly go through sort of what the profitability dynamics were and how they differ between the two situations. So, so we've talked a little bit about, we've alluded to the fact that we're going to discuss, the pricing process, and kind of what it goes down to is what are the components that contribute to the client value proposition, right? Because that's what we're trying to help support with pricing, and pricing is one piece of that. But all these elements that we have listed here actually contribute to the pricing. So, one of the things up front, and we've talked about this a couple times, defining the scope is a huge part of the process. And you want to probably do, from a best practice standpoint, these are good practices to get into, whether or not you're doing an AFA, because defining the scope and then using that as an exercise, as an opportunity to communicate with the client and establish consensus is a huge opportunity to avoid problems later, right? You're getting off on the right foot. Everybody's got equal and symmetrical information. Expectations are set, and that helps to sort of support the process, and it gets you off in the right direction. So I'm sorry, Justin, you're going to say something.
No, yeah, I agree with everything you said. And as far as this group, more focused on the LPM side, I think it's all the stuff we've talked about so far, right? To make it successful, the things on the left side, right? The first two boxes, define, scope, and workflow outline. In order to do that, you got to understand what you're trying to do. And I think that's the legwork. When Keith and I first started working together when he was at TOA, very long story short, we had a bunch of large matters, and we really, Keith, stop me if you disagree, we really put some of your partners through processes and made them do things that they hadn't done before. And the main thing was, it was a lot of upfront work of defining the matter, defining what that workflow was going to look like, how many of X, Y, and Z are going to happen, knowing that we'll be wrong. That's the key. If people say, I can't possibly predict how many expert depths we're going to have, 18 months from now. How should I know that, right? Well, we've done a lot of this work before. That's where past matter data analysis comes in. And here's a reasonable number, right? So as we're defining, as we're leveraging past data, and we're developing that workflow, okay? We're developing these assumptions, we're developing these anticipated activities. Even though we know that we're probably going to be wrong, all right, we've set ourselves up going forward with a full understanding of what the client is asking for and what the firm is selling to that client. It's a service, right? Here is what the firm is selling to the client. Here is what the client is paying for that body of work, okay? And the thing, I'll go back to the, some of the quotes and some of the things that Keith and I have talked about are the pushback is, well, hey, look, this is unbillable time, right? This is I don't have time to go through and sit through and do all this upfront work for budgeting and all that good stuff. Well, I think to come back to that, and I think that a lot of people are using, and it's being successful, is, well, look, either we do it now or we do it later. We do it now, and we're able to give the client a proposal that is our best anticipation of what's going to transpire and what they're paying for. And then if we have to have a conversation later, we have somewhere to start, rather than, God, we're crushing our budget. Now we have to go ask the client for more money. And that the tone of that conversation is going to be much different with the client, both from the difficulty of the conversation and the potential damage it does to the relationship. So there's those first two, and then I guess three on the left side, I'll kind of touch on and cover from the value of doing that work, because again, as I said before, I think people might say, yeah, that's something I already do. I don't think people do it as much as they think they do. So Keith, do you want to take risk analysis and the rest of it?
Yeah, and just to add one quick thread of conversation, those first three. So defining the scope lets you, gives you the context you need to create a workflow outline, which the next slide we'll go through, in a second here, and it's a pretty intuitive process. The point I wanted to make with the past matter data analysis that helps you create the workflow outline, I'm a fan of small data, not big data. So I wouldn't say, hey, give me every breach of contract litigation matter we've ever done at the firm, and I'm going to see what the average amount of hours was, right? That's a exaggerated example, but that's going to give you a lot of risk, right? That's going to give you a lot of error in that, because it's too broad of a category, right? You've got too much variance. I've always been a fan of, for the past matter data analysis, give me the last three matters that were as similar to this one in scope and in complexity, and let's see what we can draw out of those, whether it's, what was the leverage model, what kind of time frames took place, where did we see the biggest spikes in volume of work being done. So just to add a little flavor to the past matter aspect, it's not sort of, boiling the ocean and seeing whatever happened since the beginning of time. It's being very specific and thought out about what you're doing. The risk analysis piece comes in two forms, I would say. One is at the matter level, and that is when you go through and do your workflow outline, just identifying which elements of the workflow outline are most likely, have the highest probability of going out of scope, right? And understanding that, anticipating that, and coming to consensus with the client on that. The other aspect is, okay, from a more macro level, as a firm, are we willing to take on the risk that whatever pricing model we may be offering here is going to impose upon us based on what the dynamics of this matter are? So we could talk forever about, what some of the approval processes are and some of the things you want to look at when you analyze risk from that level. And that's really a firm by firm and matter by matter kind of thing, but just something to be aware of. So, all those things together, from a procedural standpoint, those are sort of the elements that help you develop that pricing proposal, which is the last part. And you can see there on the graphic, they all point towards value proposition for the client. The reason for that is, if you go through this process collaboratively, all those things help build credibility and what's a good word for it? I guess trust with the client, right? So those are the kind of things that clients value, more than I won't say more than anything, but it's very essential to what the value proposition is. So this process helps set the stage for a successful pricing exercise. So I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, as far as the client is never going to come to you and say, geez, you know what, you put way too much thought into how this work's going to play out, and I didn't even have to have a difficult conversation with finance throughout this whole matter. No client's ever going to complain about that, right? So, as far as Keith said, developing that trust and developing that transparency, I mean, that just leads to, not only for that matter, but overall, right? Overall, it's a good experience for the client. The result's the most important thing. Let's not lie about it. If you budget and you project manage and you do that the best in the world, but you don't have a good result, well, then really, the one's not going to outweigh the other, obviously. But things like that, I mean, you're helping the client to hit the easy button for internal pressures and internal things that they have to deal with. So.
All right, so we'll move on to the next slide, which is kind of, the focus on the workflow outline part. And I see that we're getting towards the end of our hour, so we got a couple slides left. Let's get through this. That's because we tend to editorialize on everything, but the recognized issue that we have. The workflow planning, or the sort of budgeting roadmap, right? Budgeting is at the center of not only pricing, but also obviously it's got project management value as well, because that budget that you develop to create the pricing and the assumptions that you apply that you have to then go execute against in the project management exercise. And so the two are sort of infinitely linked in my mind. But creating a matter workflow outline is going to be the same sort of process as you would do for your typical LPM exercise, right? You're going to first of all define what has to be done. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. There are certain technology tools that offer you templates and things. I personally, when I started developing matter-specific budget templates for specific types of matters, so that I would have each phase and task that could possibly happen already laid out. So that's one, it's a time saver, and it's also a good sort of a framework to start with when you go through the next, to go into the next stage, which is, who's going to do this work for each one of these phases and tasks, right? It's a very intuitive process. You say, okay, look, here's what we have to do. Who from our team are the people that can do each of these particular tasks and why? And then once you know kind of how you're going to staff each one of those, it's just a matter of, okay, what level of effort do we think it's going to take to achieve our goal for each one of these phases and tasks with these particular team members that we've assigned? What's the composition of what's going to happen to make us, to get us to the finish line for each one of these pieces? So, and then what we do from a pricing standpoint, this is where sort of the pricing piece comes in. You get that first draft of what the pricing, the budget looks like, and you apply the financials to it, right? So you apply the cost rate so you can see what your break-even price is, and then understand, all right, so, if we were to do this at, certain levels of revenue, what does that mean from us from a profitability standpoint? And back to what we talked about before, what's the value to this for the client? Because a lot of times they'll you have to understand if it's something that's complex and has a high value to the client, or it's a little bit more commoditized and doesn't have a high value. So that obviously has a correlation with the pricing that will be palatable to the client. So that's where once you apply the financials, then you can kind of go back and say, okay, let's look at a couple different scenarios that we can run here for what the pricing might be, and really think through how that might resonate with the client. So one thing I will say too, when I first started doing this, people would always say, oh, like Justin said it before, this takes too long, it's too much, it's too much effort. I don't have time for this because I can't build the time, and it's going to change anyway. A lot of times it is going to change. That's true. But I've argued with people, because I've done hundreds of these now. It doesn't take that much time. It's like 30 minutes, maybe an hour tops at the beginning of a matter. And I always try, and the other justification in addition to the one that Justin mentioned was, I always say, look, if you spend an hour at a time now, whatever your hourly billing rate is that you're not going to get to bill, if that could result in 5, 10, 15, 100 hours less of somebody else's time down the road in the middle of this matter that we're going to have to write off because we didn't take the time to plan this out and we didn't get consensus with the client, so they're not going to pay for it. So it's definitely one of those things it's a good investment in time. The only other point I would make here, I've gone through exercises like this where I'll start at the beginning and ask the lawyer that I'm working with, what do you think this would normally cost? And they'll give me a number. And then we'll go through the budgeting process, which really forces you to kind of go through and think of each aspect and take a little bit more thoughtful approach to what it is that has to happen in 2 months, in 3 months, or if X happens or if Y happens. The number that you come up with when you just kind of put a finger in the air and go, these are normally about $500,000 or whatever, right? That's usually low by about 20 to 30% in my personal experience. So it's definitely worth the diligence and the extra little bit of time to go through this process. And there's a lot of technology that's coming out now that's making it even less time that you have to spend on it with greater levels of certainty. It's some of the AI tools that we won't get into here, but they're definitely helpful. So We'll go on to the next one. That's kind of the simplified budgeting approach. So we included this because obviously, given the group, this is an LPM group, and we wanted to make sure we touched on this process. So, and I think it just shows the continuity of sort of what the process is, right? So, you've got a new potential matter. You sit down with the client, you define the scope, you come up with a workflow outline, you achieve consensus there, run some financial models, understand how you can position this from a pricing standpoint and agree on it. Then you have to deliver on that, and boom, obviously, intuitively, the next step is what do you have to do to make sure that you deliver on that, not only for your financial motivations and incentives, but also as a law firm, but also obviously to make sure paramount importance is keeping the client happy. So we won't spend a whole lot of time on these, but we just went through the process of keeping the budget or developing a budget and understanding where the pricing comes from that. Then setting up what's going to be your methodology for tracking against that budget. So there's any number of different things you can do. It's really important to understand what you need to be measuring, whether it's time, whether it's deadlines, financials, any number of milestones. So there's different things depending on the matter that you want to make sure you're focusing on in your project management exercise and activities. Understanding what will represent a change in scope or something that has to be brought to the client's attention, and then making sure you can track each of the key components of the matter, actuals, against what your budget was, so that you can that fuels the ability to understand when changes happen and what they are that happen. So it's important to have both sides engage in this process too. Communication is a huge part of the recipe here for success. As matters go on, we always say that, I like to always say that the communication plan, establishing that up front and sticking to it, is hugely important. Justin and I had a lot of success making sure that we were able to stick to those communication plans, and it really helped keep everybody on the same track and keep the information symmetrical and make sure that we were hitting the benchmarks we needed to hit. And when things changed, we both knew at the same time, and we would work together to adjust as we needed to. I've got several clients now where that's a regular part of our work together. It's a weekly call or bi-weekly call to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And sometimes they're short calls, sometimes they're not. But it's an important component of what the whole value proposition is there. And I didn't mean, Justin, did I step on you on that one, or did you say something?
No, buddy, yeah. No, let's flip to the next slide. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay. I know we're running out of time here. I just want to.
Yeah,
so
that's I'm trying to get through.
Sorry, I touched on this earlier. So as far as understanding your client, and what's the best way to go into pricing? The client says, "Hey, I want you to submit a proposal or make a pitch, or send me a number for this kind of work," right? We talked about how to get to that number, the best in our opinion, right? Best practice on how to arrive at that number, that slide with all the arrows and all that good stuff. So you've arrived at your number, right? So now understanding your client, and I guess I'm just speaking for myself and what I've heard, right? There are certain clients where, and I'm sure everybody on the call has experienced this. It's what I call the drunken sailor approach, where it doesn't matter what number or what submission that you put in, right? They're going to tell you that you are 20% too high, and they're going to pound their fist on the desk, right? So you have to understand, are you working with a client? Because Keith said, we want to collaborate. We want to work together, right? We want to make sure we both understand. It sounds very kumbaya-ish to an extent. I will say that in my experience, that works the best, right? That is the best way to ensure proper alignment and understand fees. I mean, Keith might put something in. We might go through a fee proposal based on, the major activities and things like that. And I may say, hey, Keith, I think you're high here, right? I think you're high based on benchmarks, based on what we've paid for things like this in the past. You're high, right? And then we can talk about that, okay? I've always said to the firms I use, to my firms, my counterparts of those firms, which is another key, my counterparts, that's another key in a second, that, if I don't have any good data to challenge you, I'm not going to. If I don't have a reason to say you're too high, then I'm not going to do that, because that's not fair, right? There are a lot of clients that, quite frankly, don't do that, okay? So understanding who you can really, your clients that will embrace this process, There are ancillary benefits, as I said. Even if you don't work with your client, if you're able to do the legwork up front and give them the predictability, et cetera, that's great, right? Every client's going to appreciate that. But as far as your bidding strategy and what your strategy is going into pricing with a client, I think that sometimes people try a one-size-fits-all approach, and they get burned by that sometimes, right? If you have that client that's going to always say you're 20% too high. So I think getting to know the person on the other side, whoever is evaluating that fee proposal, whether it be the attorney, whether it be somebody in legal ops like me or something like that, understanding what are their motivations, right? How are they judged internally? Because as we mentioned before, compensation models and performance evaluations at a company are different than law firms. So what can we do, right, to make sure that everybody comes out of this, A, happy that we arrived at a fair fee, and B, looking good, right? We don't have to make this too hard. This is a job. This is a way to make money for your families, for all that good, fun stuff everybody likes to do. So for pricing and fee negotiations, I encourage you, the more legwork that you can do up front, okay, if you are working with a client that is interested and you do feel comfortable in going through everything, all right, it makes it a lot less I win, you lose. It makes it that collaborative effort, right? And presenting that to clients, I don't know. I don't know if I've ever heard a story. Maybe, Keith, you've experienced one. I've never heard a story where a firm came to a client with a very not formal, but a budget proposal that really had broken down. Here are the costs that all go into this thing. And a client said, I don't care about that. I don't want to see any of that. I haven't heard that story, right? So really going there and fostering that collaborative relationship, I think, is a huge plus and a big credit to the firm. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this, because these slides are going to be made available, the director of the webinar tells me. So we obviously had to blister through some of these, but at the end of the day, I mean, the whole goal is to make the client happy. And at the end of the day, if you're able to present things and do things in such a manner where you're taking it to the client, one of two things are going to happen. Either you're going to be ahead or you're going to be behind. Very rarely will you be in the middle, right? So if you bring something to the client, a proposal like that, that's well thought out, the client's going to say one of two things. Either A, why aren't my other firms doing this, right? If you don't bring something like this, you do the typical old thing, eventually, because people like you are on webinars like this, where that is going to become the norm. So I encourage you, like, either you're ahead, either you're doing it, you're bringing it to the client for the first time, or one of very few firms, or you're not bringing it to the client. So getting things like this, taking these principles and informing the client of everything you're doing internally, right? Because that's also something that the client can sell internally, that, hey, these firms, we're really going through the motions here to make sure that we understand our fees and we're paying fair value. So I don't know. I think that's the moral of the story is that you're bringing the client something to where it fosters a collaborative discussion, a collaborative relationship focused on alignment of objectives and incentives and all that good stuff. This is one of the ways that business professionals like myself, and as far as legal professionals, partners, everybody, can help ingrain themselves with a client, get that good internal pub of, I work with so-and-so firm, they're great to work with, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I guess that's kind of my final thing, Keith. I don't know if you have anything else, or if we want to try a new question.
Just real quick, I was going to say, it must be good to be the client, because you're like, hey, you got to make the client happy. That's the key thing, but it's true. I mean, it really is. It's good to be the client. But kidding aside, Justin is one of the more, I'd say probably the most, one of the most enlightened ones I've come across in terms of just a very pragmatic and practical understanding of let's do business together and make it make sense and make it work for everyone. So I'm sure that everybody, people out there that are listening now have examples of a lot of dealing with clients that have been quite the opposite, as do I. But I think that as again, the sort of interaction between clients and firms continues to evolve, these are the types of relationships that you're going to see more of, I think, where it's going to be, let's work together and let's not try and hold each other's feet to the fire. So
right. But I think it works both ways. I think firms have to help enlighten clients, and that was very nice what you said. Thank you. Checks in the mail. But I think firms have to work to enlighten clients, right? Because most clients, as far as the legal ops, if you're dealing with procurement, they're not, they don't have a background in legal, right? I sure as heck didn't when I first started. So you need to, the business side of law at law firms is a much more developed profession than, in my opinion, the business side of corporate clients. And maybe corporate clients have been around for a while, but I think the evolution has happened faster on law firms because it's a career. In a lot of areas, clients, legal ops, or even legal ops, yeah, but especially procurement, it's not a career. It's a pit stop to where you move somewhere else. So helping to educate your clients, and as I said before, helping everybody look good, right? At the end of the day, understanding incentives and helping everybody look good. Hey, if the client, and this is just me saying this, but if you know that you're dealing with that client, that no matter what number you put in is going to be 20% too high, how many times are you going to be Charlie Brown trying to kick the football when you come in with your best number?
Exactly.
I mean, how many times are you Charlie Brown trying to kick the football? So, I mean, I'm not saying that anybody does anything untoward or anything like that, but I think you need to understand pricing strategy and things like that. Or other questions are, okay, hey, you're too high, but if we've defined the scope properly, then we say, okay, well then where should we cut scope? Rather than take the focus off of the fees, okay, well we scope this out together, right? So where do we cut? So where should we cut scope? Or we didn't scope this out together, but here is the the scope, the bill of goods that we're selling you, right? So what would you like us to cut out? Would you like us to reduce the number of depositions, the number of interviews? Do you think that, hey, you know what, we don't have to file this motion for A, B, and C because you know what, we file it all the time, never worked once, not only for us, but for anybody in our industry. It's more of a procedural thing that everybody just kind of does. Maybe we take that out. Maybe we, so anytime you're able to shift the fee discussion from the fee to the work, I think you win. And so I don't know. That's just kind of where I would go. But I don't think that it's in the firm's best interest to wait for clients to turn the corner. I think it's in the firm's best interest to help the clients turn the corner.
Mm-hmm. And we'll just quickly address these couple, and we'll get to the last slide. I know we're over time, so I apologize for running over to everyone. Justin mentioned this: be strategic with your opening bid. I have more stories than I could count of where I'll be working with a partner to develop a pricing strategy, and they'll want to give away the farm on the first bid because they're really afraid to get the work. And as Justin alluded to, it's a negotiation, so you don't want to go in with your lowest number because they're always going to come back and ask you for more. So just make sure you, quote unquote, keep some powder dry, as I like to say. And part of that relates to the second point of don't fear a counteroffer. If you give a certain proposal and the client comes back and says, well, I think it should be more like this, that doesn't mean it absolutely has to be that number because they're going to be aggressive in their counteroffer, and you have to go back and negotiate and find a middle ground. So just don't be afraid of the counteroffer and assume that that's a mandate, because usually it isn't. We talked about reframing beyond discounts. There's other ways to get around that. And, the larger relationship, Justin spoke to that, so I won't belabor that point either. Real quick, last slide, then we can do, if anybody has any questions. I know we've gone over our time substantially now. Just in terms of a little sort of looking into the crystal ball, what's in the future, kind of more of the same of the things that we've discussed. I think we've kind of, addressed a lot of these points already. But collaboration, not only from the legal side, there's ways that in-house and law firm legal teams are working together much more collaboratively now on working out process maps and identifying efficiencies and how they can work together better in executing substantive legal engagements. And then obviously the financial and operations side is a lot of the things we've been discussing here today. And it's good to have the point and counterpoint side of things to kind of see how you can engage in some of these activities. A lot of it's got to do with what are we going to be measuring, and how does that, what are each side's value drivers, and how do we make sure that we're not only working to achieve the client's value drivers, but our own, and vice versa, and helping to support that, the transparency with sharing information and data. There's a lot of different technology that's helping support those activities now, but it can just be conversations, asking your client, what do you need to see? Even if it's something as simple as shadow bills, even though we try and discourage that, what is it that's going to help you understand what we're doing and help us all work together better? So there's going to be a continued increase in data-driven insights and decisions I mentioned a few times there's new technologies coming out now that really give us a whole lot more visibility into the work that's done on particular matters and how it's done. So those hold a lot of promise, and they're gaining momentum and gaining exposure in the market. I won't kill the next one, ROI. So I would rephrase that basically as profitability versus realization, to make sure that you're keeping some money where it makes sense and keeping the amount of money that is consistent with the value to the client for different matters. And sometimes you give up a little margin to make a client happy where it makes sense. There's always a strong case for that's made to me when there's an opportunity for a loss leader, but I always say a loss leader is only a leader if it leads to something that's not a loss. So that means you can't just give away the farm with no sort of attachment or strategy to get more practical work, because then all you're doing, profitable work, because then all you're doing is setting an expectation with that client that you'll do work for an incredibly low price, and they're going to want to do more work for you at an incredibly low price. So that doesn't help either side.